Now in our 26th year, more than a quarter of a century of service to the worldwide amateur radio community, we are This Week in Amateur Radio. Your all-amateur radio and technology news magazine and bulletin service of the air. This is edition, number 1353, with a release and air date of Saturday, February 1st, 2025. Please take the program to your air, following the cue tone.
On the air around the world on the amateur radio bands, and podcasting on the internet since 1993, we are This Week in Amateur Radio. Serving the amateur radio community with weekly, amateur radio news and special features. We are the worldwide premier amateur radio and technology news magazine and bulletin service of the air. Here are the stories for release around the earth as we come to air with edition number 1353 of This Week in Amateur Radio. Your fellow amateurs in Florida invite you to warm up at the upcoming 2025 Orlando Hamcation to be held February 7th through the 9th. A longtime ham radio outlet employee is honored for 60 years in amateur radio. Senators Cruz and Markey reintroduced the AM Radio Act in Congress. Innovation, Science and Economic Development Canada unwrap the new basic amateur radio question bank. A repeater group plans to enhance safety in eastern Colorado. Amateur radio has been a hobby for well over a century. We will tell you the story about amateur radio's historic secret listeners. The ARRL Teachers Institute is a success on Staten Island. SpaceX launches multiple ham satellites on a ride-share mission, while 2 private moonlanders have launched. Get ready for a ham radio open house on World Amateur Radio Day. The ARRL Club Grant Program awards $500,000 to help grow amateur radio. Sony ends Blu-Ray, MiniDisk and MiniDV media production. And we will tell you how to hack a motorized RV satellite dish for tracking low Earth orbit satellites. These headline stories will come to you in a moment, along with this week's special features. We'll visit with Bruce Page, KK5DO, and get an update from AMSAT and what's new with all those amateur satellites in orbit. Australia's own Ono Benshop, Phi K6FLAB, and Foundations of Amateur Radio will be here with Scene 7 of his open source project, The Bald Yak. This time out, Ono covers building a circuit without that burnt chicken smell. Our own amateur radio historian, Will Rogers, K5WLR, will be here with another edition of A Century of Amateur Radio. This time out, Will has us board the Wayback Machine to 1916 when amateurs were experimenting with the atmosphere and trying to figure out how propagation worked, in a story called Strangely Behaving Signals. And we will stop by and visit with Bill Salyers, AJ8B in the DX Corner, with all the latest news on DXpeditions, DX, upcoming radio sport contests, and more. That's all straight ahead as North America's premier amateur radio and technology news magazine and bulletin service, This Week in Amateur Radio, takes to the air right now. Reporting from our headquarters studio just outside Albany, New York, where we are recovering from a full day of wintry mixed weather, this is W2XBS.
And reporting from our news bureau just outside Albany, New York, in the Geek Cave studios, I'm Rich Lawrence, KB2MOB.
And reporting this week from our news bureau in downtown Syracuse, New York, in Armory Square, I'm Chris Perrine, KB2FAF.
And from sunny, beautiful Naugatuck, Connecticut, where the sun always shines, I'm Steve Sawyer, K1FRC.
And reporting from our news bureau here in Western Mass, where the coffee is great, and the only thing breaking squelch more than the radios is my neighbor's dog, I'm Marvin Turner, W0MET.
And reporting from our bureau in Dallas, where we've returned to seasonal temperatures after a cold snap, I'm Tammy, KI5ODE.
And reporting from our soggy news bureau in Knoxville, Tennessee, I'm Josh Marler, AA4WX.
And reporting from our Troy, New York News Bureau, where winter's not done with us quite yet, I'm Eric, KD2RJX.
And reporting from our ham radio outposts in the western Catskill Mountains of upstate New York, where a February thaw announces the last gasp of winter and the beginning of mud season, I'm Don Hulick, K2ATJ.
And reporting from our news bureau in Fayetteville, Arkansas, where we're on the weather roller coaster of temps, I'm Will Rogers, K5WLR.
I'm Rich, KB2MOB, and here's our lead story this week. Amateur radio operators from across the country and even from around the world flocked to Florida in February for the annual Orlando Hamcation, one of the largest and most anticipated hamfests in the country. With more on this popular annual gathering, we go to John Ross, KD8IDJ, who files this special report from League headquarters.
Hamcation includes all of the popular mainstays of a full-featured convention, including exhibits and vendors, swaps, tailgate, and food. A full slate of forums will cover emergency communications, outreach to younger audiences, teens and college students, and high-tech topics like software-defined radio, remote operating, antenna design, and the fascinating world of pico balloons and tiny transmitters. This year's Hamcation will also host the ARRL Southeastern Division Convention. This highlights the region's most active amateur radio community and member volunteers from Florida, Alabama, Georgia, Puerto Rico, and the U.S. Virgin Islands. ARRL representatives, including ARRL Southeastern Division Director Mickey Baker, N4MB, and Vice Director Andy Mazzulli, KK4LWR, will be in attendance, along with First Vice President Kristen McIntyre, K6WX, and CEO David Midster, NA2AA. It's a great opportunity to engage with some of the key voices in the world of amateur radio and to find out ways that you can volunteer and extend your support for ARRL. For those eager to get hands-on experience, attendees will be able to operate Special Event Station W1AW/4 throughout Hamcation, so be sure to carry a copy of your amateur radio license with you. There will also be satellite operating demonstrations organized by ARRL members Sloan Davis, N3UPS, and Tom Gaines, KB5FHK. A helpful addition for navigating the sprawling event is the ARRL Events app, which is free to download for both Apple and Android devices. The app will help you find and schedule forums, track prize drawings, and locate all of the vendors. It's a great way to make sure you don't miss any of the action. Visit your app store to download the app and search ARRL Events. I'm John Ross, KD8IDJ.
Once again, the Orlando Hamcation is February 7th through the 9th, 2025, at the Central Florida Fairgrounds and Expo Park in Orlando, Florida. For more details, you can find them on the web at www.hamcation.com.
Paul Zerbinski, W9KHO, an employee of Ham Radio Outlet in Milwaukee, Wisconsin, received a certificate of honor from Ham Radio Outlet President Robert Ferrero, W6KR, for 60 years as an amateur radio operator. This is just the second time the award has been presented. Zerbinski's history in radio dates to 1964, when after being honorably discharged from the United States Air Force, he began working for High Gain Electronics in Lincoln, Nebraska. In 1967, Zerbinski began working at Amateur Electronic Supply in Milwaukee. In 2016, when AES aligned with HRO, Paul became the most senior sales associate, and he continues to work at the HRO Milwaukee store. ARRL Wisconsin Assistant Section Manager Tom Saja, KG9EE, extended his best wishes to Zerbinski. Congratulations, Paul, for your dedication to the amateur radio hobby and the amateur radio industry, wrote Saja.
The Amateur Radio on the International Space Station program is seeking formal and informal education, institutions, and organizations, individually or working together, to host an amateur radio contact with a crew member on board the ISS. ARIS anticipates that the contact would be held between July 1st, 2025 and December 31st, 2025. Crew scheduling and ISS orbits will determine the exact contact dates. To maximize these radio contact opportunities, ARIS is looking for organizations that will draw large numbers of participants and integrate the contact into a well-developed education plan. The deadline to submit a proposal is February 28, 2025. Proposal information and more details such as expectations, proposal guidelines, and the proposal form can be found at www.aris.org. Crew members aboard the International Space Station will participate in scheduled amateur radio contacts. These radio contacts are approximately 10 minutes in length and allow students to interact with the astronauts through a question-and-answer session. An ARIS contact is a voice-only communication opportunity via amateur radio between astronauts and cosmonauts aboard the space station and classrooms and communities. ARIS contacts afford education audiences the opportunity to learn firsthand from astronauts what it is like to live and work in space and to learn about space research conducted on the ISS. Students also will have an opportunity to learn about satellite communication, wireless technology, and radio science. Because of the nature of human spaceflight and the complexity of scheduling activities aboard the ISS, organizations must demonstrate flexibility to accommodate changes in dates and times of the radio contact. Amateur radio organizations around the world, with the support of NASA and space agencies in Canada, Japan, Europe, and Russia, present educational organizations with this opportunity. The ham radio organization's volunteer efforts provide the equipment and operational support to enable communication between crew on the ISS and students around the world using amateur radio.
Coming up on our 26th year keeping the amateur radio community around the world informed, you are listening to This Week in Amateur Radio. Available worldwide as a podcast from our web at twiar.net.
Citing the role of radio in protecting the public during the Los Angeles wildfires, Senator Ed Markey and Ted Cruz have reintroduced the AM Radio for Every Vehicle Act in the 119th Congress to ensure automakers continue including AM in new vehicles at no extra charge. The legislation would direct the National Highway Traffic Safety Administration to mandate AM radio as a standard safety feature in all new cars. Initially introduced in May 2023, the AM Radio for Every Vehicle Act advanced through both the Senate Commerce Committee and the House Energy and Commerce Committee last year. Even with 271 co-sponsors in the House and a supermajority in 63 in the Senate, the bill was never scheduled for a vote. The 2025 version is on its way to recapturing that broad bipartisan support, with more than 40 senators already signing on as co-sponsors. Markey commented, "As we witness more tragic climate change-induced disasters like the wildfires in Los Angeles, broadcast AM radio continues to be a critical tool for communication. Tens of millions of listeners across the country have made it clear they want AM radio to remain in their vehicles. Our AM Radio for Every Vehicle Act heeds their words and ensures that this essential tool doesn't get lost on the dial." Cruz remarked, "During weather disasters or power outages, AM radio is consistently the most reliable form of communication and is critical to keep millions of Texans safe. AM radio has long been a haven for people to express differing viewpoints, allowing free speech and our robust democratic process to flourish for decades. I am honored to once again partner with Senator Markey on this bipartisan legislation on behalf of our constituents who depend on AM radio and public airwaves for access to news, music, talk, and emergency alerts," he added. National Association of Broadcast President and CEO Curtis Legite commented, "The NAB is deeply grateful to Chairman Cruz and Senator Markey, along with their bipartisan co-sponsors, for reintroducing legislation to ensure that AM radio remains readily accessible in all vehicles. Time and again, AM radio has proven itself as an irreplaceable resource in emergencies, keeping families safe and communities informed when every second counts. Further, its diversity of programming and reach remain unique amongst all audio media. We urge Congress to move quickly to pass this important legislation and ensure Americans continue to benefit from this free life-saving service."
To help promote amateur radio science and technology, and to honor the 100th anniversary of the International Amateur Radio Union, the ARRL is inviting radio clubs and schools to organize a ham radio open house in April, built around World Amateur Radio Day on April 18th. With more on this upcoming event, we go to John Ross, KD8 IDJ, who files this special report from League headquarters.
The event is intended to highlight the amateur radio service for its development and practice of the latest radio communications and technology, and as a hands-on pathway into science, technology, engineering, and mathematics, STEM fields for the next generation. In April, amateur radio clubs, school stations, and other groups will have the opportunity to advance public knowledge about ham radio by welcoming their communities into their stations for the Ham Radio Open House as part of the World Amateur Radio Day. The focus will be on scientific advancement and demonstrating cutting-edge technology. This is a chance not only to shape the conversation about modern ham radio, but also to show how it serves as a stepping stone and a test bed for many young people pursuing STEM education and future high-tech careers. ARRL has teamed up with HamSci, Ham Radio Science Citizen Investigation, and the science community organization SciStarter to invite the public to participate in 1 million acts of science during April, which is Citizen Science Month. By hosting a ham radio open house at your group station on April 18th, you'll introduce individuals who might never otherwise find out about today's amateur radio, where science and technology intersect with fun and learning. ARRL Public Relations and Outreach Manager Sierra Harrop, W5DX, said ARRL is excited to work with HamSci and SciStarter on this project. This is an exciting opportunity to really reclaim the public's image of ham radio and show them the modern, cutting-edge technology that's in use by many amateurs, she said. Clubs are encouraged to showcase the latest weak signal modes, such as FT8 using WSJT-X or other digital modes. This could be a great opportunity to explore new areas of amateur radio and demonstrate how the service is at the cutting edge of electrical engineering. I'm John Ross, KD8I-DJ.
Look for resources to help organize and promote the event soon. Find details online at www.arrl.org.
It is time for this month's edition of the Volunteer Monitor Program Report. The Volunteer Monitor Program is a joint initiative between ARRL and the FCC to enhance compliance in the amateur radio service. This is the most recent edition activity report of the Volunteer Monitor Program. Commendations were issued to amateurs in Sequim, Moses Lake, Richland, Bot-Hell, Morton, and Soap Lake, Washington, Placerville, California, and Bend, Oregon, for exemplary operation as net control operators of the Columbia Basin net operating on 3.960 MHz. An amateur radio operator in Maryland received a commendation for exemplary AM operation, and for explaining proper AM operating procedures and transmitter settings to those participating in AM communications. Operators in Louisiana and Arizona received advisories for operation with expired licenses. A technician class operator in Florida received an advisory for FT8 operation on 40 meters. Technicians can only use CW on 40 meters. A technician class operator in Utah received an advisory concerning FT8 operation on 30 meters. Technicians have no operating privileges on 30 meters. An operator in Florida received an advisory for unattended robotic FT8 operation on 14.074 MHz. Under FCC Rule 97.221 Subpart B, an unattended station may be auto-controlled only while transmitting on RTTY or data on the subbands of 14.0950 to 14.0995 or 14.1005 to 14.112 MHz. Such stations may not call CQ and can only respond to being polled. The totals for this report's monitoring were 1,562 hours on HF frequencies and 2,215 hours on VHF frequencies and above, for a total of 3,777 hours. We thank Volunteer Monitor Program Administrator Riley Hollingsworth, K4ZDH, for this report.
On January 27, Innovation, Science and Economic Development Canada, or ISED, released the new Basic Qualification Question Bank for amateur radio. This new question bank will be used for all basic amateur radio certifications beginning July 15. Until then, the old Basic Question Bank will be used for all basic exams. Candidates, instructors, and authors of the amateur radio study guides may wish to study the new question bank, which is available for download from the ISED website. Since early 2023, Radio Amateurs of Canada has had a committee of 20 instructors and accredited examiners working to update and improve the quality of the 980 questions, the 984 correct answers, and 2,900 distractors in the question bank. This was the first major update to the question bank since 2013. Radio amateurs of Canada's Examination Standards Committee worked closely with ISED officers on the final versions of the exams, which were agreed upon by the RAC and the ISED in late 2024. Radio Amateurs of Canada has prepared the following documents to help with the transition to the new question bank. A bilingual document which contains old questions next to the new questions and provides notes explaining the changes, and a separate English and French version of the document containing a list of the 201 new questions.
37 amateur radio clubs benefited from $500,502 in grants through the ARRL Club Grant Program to implement projects that educate, recruit, train, and promote amateur radio in their communities. Funding for the grants comes from Amateur Radio Digital Communications. There were 110 applicants to the 2024 ARRL Club Grant Program, with applicants from all ARRL divisions and 40 states, requesting nearly $1.6 million in support, in amounts ranging from as small as $1,000 to as large as the maximum of $25,000. Funds were distributed to the clubs in December of 2024. Some examples of the work that will be accomplished via these grants include upgrades to antennas within Florida's SARNet, a statewide linked UHF repeater network that is used extensively by emergency managers during hurricanes, enhancements of amateur radio-based telemetry systems on board Illinois Space Society projects, and many programs targeting youth outreach. These grants are possible because of the strong partnership between ARRL and ARDC, said ARRL Director of Development Kevin Beal, K8EAL, and provide transformational impact for the next generation of amateur radio clubs.
You're listening to North America's premier amateur radio and technology news magazine of the air. We are This Week in Amateur Radio, distributed worldwide at twiar.net.
As promised, President Donald Trump signed an order officially designating Brendan Carr as the new FCC chairman. With the change, former Chair Jessica Rosenworcel formally resigned from the commission, as is tradition. Carr steps into the leadership role without requiring Senate approval. He was first appointed to the FCC by President Trump in 2017 and has been confirmed unanimously by the Senate 3 times. Before his appointment, he served as the agency's general counsel and worked as an attorney at Wiley Ryan, LLP. Carr also clerked for Judge Dennis Shedd on the U.S. Court of Appeals for the Fourth Circuit. In a statement, Chairman Carr said, quote, "I am deeply grateful to President Trump and honored by his decision to designate me as chairman of the Federal Communications Commission. I have had the privilege of working at the FCC for over a dozen years now, including serving previously as the agency's general counsel, and I am humbled by the opportunity to lead the FCC. The FCC has important work ahead on issues ranging from tech and media regulation to unleashing new opportunities for jobs and growth through agency actions on spectrum, infrastructure, and the space economy. We will also advance America's national security interests and protect consumers. I am eager to accelerate the FCC's work on these and other fronts. I look forward to collaborating with the Trump administration, my commission colleagues, and the FCC's talented staff, as well as Congress, to deliver great results for the American people." Unquote. Ahead of taking his new position, Carr outlined a comprehensive agenda focusing on media trust, regulatory reforms, and technological oversight. In a recent interview, Carr emphasized the need to address declining public trust in media, suggesting that the FCC will reassess broadcasters' obligation to operate in the public interest, saying broadcast licensees are not sacred cows. Carr will likely revisit previous FCC decisions, particularly regarding media ownership and foreign influence. He highlighted the expected approval of Odyssey's restructuring plan, that which includes significant investment from entities linked to George Soros. Carr described this process as unprecedented, criticizing the bypassing of established procedures without public or federal agency input. As for the Commission's newly vacated seat, President Trump announced Olivia Trusty as his nominee for FCC Commissioner.
Although repeater systems are often viewed as safety nets by travelers as well as emergency responders, these wireless layers of protection are not everywhere. One group in eastern Colorado has been working to change that. The Eastern Colorado Repeater Association is a small and very new group that has taken on a big job to close what one organizer calls the repeater communication gap across eastern Colorado. The organizer, Brian Wheeler, KB9UZO, is a retired firefighter and aircraft mechanic who has assembled a group of radio operators specifically to fill what he considers a dead zone in that part of the state. Brian writes on the group's GoFundMe page that with no reliable radio coverage in the state's Eastern Plains region, the effort's first priority is to expand coverage via VHF and UHF, DMR and APRS through a linked repeater system. He said that testing has already begun with a repeater in eastern El Paso County on 147.030 MHz, but progress is slow because of limited resources. At the same time, Brian said he hopes he can create a network of something just as reliable and important. A welcoming community of hams like him who are involved in experimenting with technology and in growing a cohesive community of radio amateurs. He writes, "We want every member to feel included, heard, and appreciated as we work together to strengthen communications networks and enrich the amateur radio experience throughout the region."
The Radio Society of Great Britain has announced that it is an official partner for this year's British Science Week, run by the British Science Association. The RSGB outreach team worked with the RSGB communications team to offer an amateur radio-related activity, and this will feature in the British Science Week Community Pack. This links with the Society's strategic priority of growth and its desire to reach new audiences. The Society is very excited that amateur radio will be featured for the first time in this important national STEM campaign. This year's event runs from the 7th to the 16th of March with the theme Change and Adapt. It is not just for young people, and the RSGB has a range of additional activity ideas that you could try with your community, friends, and family too. The RSGB hopes its ideas and resources will encourage many to get out there and inspire others.
With the slow demise of physical media the past few years, companies are gradually closing shop on producing everything from the physical media itself to their players and recorders. For Sony, this seems to have now escalated to where it'll be shuttering its optical media storage operations completely after more than 18 years of producing Blu-ray discs. This also includes MiniDisk media and MiniDV cassettes. We previously reported on Sony ending the production of recordable Blu-ray media for consumers, which now seems to have expanded to Sony's remaining storage media. It also raises the likelihood that Sony's next game console, like the PlayStation 6, will not feature any optical drive at all, while MiniDV likely was the only interesting to those of us still lugging one of those MiniDV camcorders around. The loss of MiniDisk production may be felt quite strongly in the indie music scene, where MiniDisk is experiencing somewhat of a revival alongside cassette tapes and vinyl records. Although it would appear that physical media is now effectively dead in favor of streaming services, it might be too soon to mark its demise.
It is time for this week's edition of AMSAT Satellite Shorts from all over. We begin this week with an announcement from HAMSAI. HAMSAI has announced its personal space weather station sessions via Zoom. The Personal Space Weather Station Network is a distributed series of receivers designed to measure the space environment. These stations are built by professionals, citizen scientists, and ham radio operators. HAMSAI and its partners are constantly at work on expanding the network, improving the Personal Space Weather Station data collection hardware and software, growing the network infrastructure for data storage and retrieval, as well as meeting HAMSAI's ultimate goal, analysis of the collected data. AMSAT has announced a recurring series of Zoom-based sessions to help those interested in the project. Sessions occur each Thursday at 10 a.m. Eastern. More information is available on the AMSAT website. And finally, this week, electronic propulsion is being increasingly used on space missions and could ultimately replace thrusters using chemical rockets. Spacecraft powered by electric propulsion could soon be better protected against their own exhaust thanks to new supercomputer simulations. Electric propulsion is a more efficient alternative to traditional chemical rockets, and there are even plans to use electric propulsion on NASA's Lunar Gateway space station. The idea behind electric propulsion is that an electric current ionizes or removes an electron from atoms of a neutral gas, such as xenon or krypton, stored on board the spacecraft. The ionization process produces a cloud of ions and electrons. Then a principle called the Hall effect generates an electric field that accelerates the ions and electrons and channels them into a characteristically blue plume that emerges from a spacecraft at over 60,000 kilometers per hour. Hence, an electric propulsion system is also referred to as an ion engine.
You are listening to This Week in Amateur Radio, available to download as a podcast from anywhere on the web podcasts are available.
Hello and welcome to the DX Corner for your weekly dose of DX. I'm Bill, AJ8B. If you're wondering, and I'll bet you're not, I was not able to get out and replace the 30-meter trap on my vertical. I know I've been whining about this for 3 or 4 weeks. There were about 9 inches of snow around it, and now it's about 9 inches of slush. However, we're about to get 2 inches of rain Friday into Saturday, and the temperatures are going to be in excess of 50 degrees, so I hope that helps. My plan is to get it done early Saturday or sometime on Sunday. We shall see. There is a lot of DX activity going on, so let's get started. This section of DX News comes from Bernie, W3UR, editor of the Daily DX, the Weekly DX, and the How's DX column in QST. If you would like a free 2-week trial of the Daily DX, your only source of real-time DX information, just drop me a note at thedxmentor@gmail.com and I'll hook you up. There are many rumors floating around regarding the SV-A Mount Athos DXpedition. It's important to rely on trusted sources like the Daily DX for the most accurate information. As of Thursday morning, Bernie reports that, quote, there's been no update from the Mount Athos team since 1800 Zulu yesterday. Dave, G4WFQ, reports that the SV-1GA-A QO100 satellite QSOs have been uploaded to Clublog and that OQRS has been turned off. QRX as the Daily DX will continue to provide updates. Hotel Delta 8 Golf will be on the air April 18th to the 26th from the Galapagos Islands. This DXpedition, 1 year in the planning, will encompass 22 operators from Ecuador, Brazil, India, Serbia, and Russia, managing 8 stations at 2 sites on Santa Cruz Island, with 1 station dedicated to satellites and 1 dedicated to EME. There will also be a station dedicated to 6 meters. The team's official advisors are NE8Z Rick and OK1 BOA Petra. We received great support from ACOM, one of the world's leading manufacturers of RF linear amplifiers, and other manufacturers. End quote. However, airfare and baggage costs have skyrocketed. Thus, the team seeks individual US $10 donations via their website. This will guarantee immediate LOTW confirmation and priority mailing of paper QSLs. They are also selling souvenirs, including shirts, caps, and mugs. Finally, they ask that people visit their sponsors, all of which are listed on their website. They welcome commercial and organizational donations as well. K4 Zulu Whiskey Ken was in Juba, South Sudan this week. He made over 4,600 CW and sideband QSOs as Zulu 81 Zulu. His logs should be uploaded to LOTW by now. Ken would like to thank Daya, Z81 Delta, for all his, quote, wonderful support and hospitality. The Z81Z QSOs can be confirmed via K4ZW. See the instructions posted on the Z81ZQRZ.com webpage. Allen, KH7AL/KH9, continues to operate on a time-available basis while on Wake Island. Al notes, not entirely tongue-in-cheek, that this schedule is, quote, subject to change due to sudden tropical downpours, typhoons, pestering birds, spooky noises in the dark, QRM, big spiders, rogue waves, hermit crab rebel uprisings, and of course work. Charlie 21 Tango Sierra, Phil in Nauru, initially planned to finish in Nauru by February 2025, but has now decided to stay until September 2025. After that, he will take a 2-month leave. During his time there, Nauru has improved its ranking on Club Log's DXCC Most Wanted list from 54 to 106, thanks to his efforts and those of C21MM. C21MM put 90,000 QSOs in the log last October. Currently, C21TS has 83,000 QSOs with minimal duplicates as he does not use MSHV. He aims to reach 100,000 QSOs before leaving. His DXCC count stands at 221 confirmed. Operating mainly on FT8 with 25 watts, he uses a small vertical antenna for 30 meters and above and an end-fed half-wave antenna for 40 and 80. He may try single sideband soon, but not CW. He also hopes to attempt 160 meters, although it might be challenging without an amplifier. C5PL from the Gambia will be operated by LB0OG Marson on single sideband and FT8 MSHV. SP1C will operate CW. SP1FM will handle the single sidebands and FT8 MSHV chores, and SQ1GU will be on sideband. This de-expedition is scheduled for January 31 to February 7th from the, quote, One Love Beach Bar near Ghana Parks on the air and Worldwide Flora and Fauna site. They also plan on POTA and WWF with the C5PL/P call signs. For all operations, they will be on 80 through 6 meters with a focus on 20 through 10. Udo, HB9ERD, also known as DL3GN, is on holiday this month, operating as CN2GN from several locations throughout Morocco. He's using a Yaesu FT857 on QRP-CW. QSL either of his home calls, HB9ERD or DL3GN. Bob Sutton, who's no stranger to this column, ZL1RS or E51EME, is planning a 6-meter and 10-meter de-expedition from Nui in May 2025. He will operate as E6RS and will be focused on the Magic Band, 6 meters. Bob is also planning a 6 and 10-meter de-expedition to Afate Island, Vanuatu in June, where he will operate as YJ0RS. During both trips, he will only be on 10 meters if 6 meters is closed, and you can QSL that trip via ZL1RS. The 44th Indian Scientific Expedition to Antarctica member VU2DJR, Denny, shares details about his upcoming radio operations from the Bharati Research Station in Larsman Hills, Antarctica. He is there now through early 2026 and will be operating his spare time with a special call sign AT44I. He'll be running 100 watts from an IC7100 into a half-wave dipole. Activity will be on sideband CW and FT8 on 20, 15, and 10. QSLs will be uploaded to LOTW and Club Log, and you can also QSL via VU2DGR. On February 22, 2025, members of the Caboolture Radio Club, including VK4AWB ALF, will be traveling to Norfolk Island. They will be conducting radio operations from February 22, 2025 to March 1, 2025, covering all HF bands during the week, including attempting a world record distance on 630 meters and 2200 meters with call signs VK9YB. Additionally, they will operate FT8 mode. The call signs used for this operations will be VK9QD, VK9YB, and VK9AB. The Rebel DX Group's 5 November 9 Delta Tango Golf DXpedition, which we talked about last week, has been delayed due to flight cancellations. It was initially set for January 25th, but it's now expected to start around January 30th. So I hope it's QRV by the time you hear this. Delta Fox 2 Whiskey Oscar Harold has an upcoming 9 X-Ray 2 Alpha Whiskey operation from near Kigali today through February 15th. Harold has a Yaesu FT991 running 100 watts to a hex beam, a vertical, and a 4-element Yagi on 6. He also has an 80 centimeter dish for QO100. He plans on 160 through 6 meters CW, sideband FT8, FT4, and Q65. Late Wednesday, 2344 Zulu, Bob, K4MZU, contacted Eric, KB1EHE, and Elsie, KB1IFZ, aboard the National Geographic Explorer headed to King George Island in the South Shetland Islands, and they're hoping to use VP0H. They were using 20 watts with a vertical antenna and had 5x8 signals on the ship. Bob noted that they worked many stations in North and South America. Operating from the ship's bridge, their antenna was high above the water near King George. They plan to go to shore today and operate a stroke KC4, looking for Europe between 1800 to 2000 UTC. They will be QRV from the island during the day and from the ship at night as stroke MM. And remember, the only one that's going to count is when they're on the island. The stroke MM QSOs don't count. I received the following from our friend Charles, 5 Hotel 3 Delta X-Ray. Quote, I will arrive in Tanzania February 20th and depart on March 6th. This is an official visit for a groundbreaking ceremony for the Chihoni Medical Center, so 5 Hotel 3 DX will most likely operate from a hotel room, sporadically at best. On my last trip, FT8 was reliable, but CW was hopeless in that setting. I certainly will try to work CW and FT4, FT8, but it depends on propagation and local conditions. There may be more 15 and 10 meter opportunities if recent conditions are any indication. I look forward to a more relaxed visit later this year, at which I should be able to do more operating with better antennas and in a more suitable settings. I will be in Tanzania using the call 5 Hotel 3 DX. My home call is NK80. If you need a QSL, please send them directly only. Do not use the bureau. Request per the instructions via PayPal, email for paper cards. I will also be using LOTW and Club Log, and there is more information on my 5 Hotel 3 DX page. 7-3 from Charles, 5 Hotel 3 DX, stroke NK80, stroke VE3 ISD. The DX Mentor podcast stroke YouTube channel featured Charles and his exploits in Tanzania in an episode last year. You can access the YouTube version via YouTube and search for the DX Mentor and then look for the 5 Hotel 3 DX episode. You can also listen via your podcast app by adding the DX Mentor to your favorite podcast and then again searching for 5 Hotel 3 DX. And finally, speaking of the DX Mentor, a new podcast episode should drop by the time you're listening to this regarding the upcoming TI-1 RRC DXpedition to Panama, Costa Rica, and Nicaragua. Each stop will involve some POTA activity, and you don't want to miss this because they're going to cover a lot of countries in a short time, so it's well worth giving that a listen. So here's a little information on contests. I know that the ARL contest sheet is read elsewhere in this podcast, and the contests that I mentioned are typically redundant. However, there are a few contests that I have found to be especially useful for DXers who are trying to fill band slots or to get entities or zones in the log that may otherwise be difficult to get. The ARL announces a new DXCC Triton Award. The ARL Board of Director Programs and Services Committee and the ARL headquarters staff are creating a new DXCC award, the DXCC Triton, which will recognize those who achieve DXCC using CW, phone, and digital modes. Higher achievement endorsements can be earned at the 200, 300, and honor roll levels. The DXCC Triton Award is intended to spur greater on-air operating and to inspire those using digital modes to also develop their skills in and practice of CW and sideband. And I'll try to get more details in our next episode. The next contest that I'm gearing up for is the CQ Worldwide RIDI WPX contest. Having a call like AJ8B is somewhat a multiplier for me in the WPX contest, and this contest is an absolute blast. The exchange is simple. It's RST and a serial number. It'll run from 0 Zulu on February 8th to 2359 on February 9th. You get more points for QSOs on 40 and 80 meters, but you do get points for QSOs in the same country as well. Check it out and let me know what you think. Until next week, this is Bill, AJ8B saying 7-3, and thanks to my XYL Karen for her love and support. I hope to hear you in the pile-ups.
You are listening to North America's premier news and information service for the amateur radio hobbyist. We are This Week in Amateur Radio.
Welcome to the 16th segment of Ham Radio History, a century of amateur radio. Ham's organizations, events, inventions. I'm Will Rogers, K5WLR. I want to extend our appreciation to Chris Cadella, W2PA, for allowing us to use his website in the preparation of these programs. Now here comes the next of his chapters of Ham Radio History. Strangely behaving signals. While the causes for QRM were well understood, mostly man-made, and could be dealt with through cooperation and tuning techniques, other disruptive on-air phenomena were clearly beyond such controls, those caused by nature. Some, such as static, QRN, also called strays, although understood to a large degree, had no known effective remedy. Others, such as fading, were not understood at all. At constant transmitter power, what natural phenomena could possibly cause a signal to fluctuate in strength? Why wasn't a transmitter signal strength simply determined by the distance to the receiver? One West Coast amateur who wrote to QSD about signal fading wondered if East Coast amateurs were experiencing anything similar. He cited an IRE Proceedings article, Volume 4, Number 2, that discussed the phenomenon. A Captain Bullard, who had offered a theory of a conductive layer above the Earth at an altitude that was higher in the daytime and lower at night. The IRE, the Institute of Radio Engineers, was one of the pieces that combined later to form the Institute of Electrical and Electronics Engineers, IEEE. This might account for the stronger nighttime signals because the energy in the waves was being confined to a smaller space. He was almost right. Professor A. Hoyt Taylor held a Ph.D. in physics and had most recently taught at the universities of Wisconsin and North Dakota. He was chairman of the physics department. Also an active ham operating under a special license as 9XN, he had taken an early professional interest in radio propagation and antennas. In QST, he discussed sources of signal variations without ever using the word propagation, based on experimental results he had already published in the IRE Proceedings. Taylor would go on to be superintendent of the radio division at the Naval Research Laboratory from 1923 to 1945 and contribute to the development of radar. He was also president of the Institute of Radio Engineers, IRE, in 1929. Differences in signal behavior between day and night, summer and winter, were well known, but their origins were not. By variations, Taylor meant real-time changes in strength, often referred to as freaks or swings, and now called QSB, which were most often noticed at twilight. They were also more noticeable at long distances and short wavelengths. He therefore suggested experimenting during winter nights when long distances became more possible with short wavelengths. Taylor further observed that signals fell off with distance much faster than the inverse square law, which, applied in free space, would predict. The inverse square law states that the strength decreases with the square of the distance. For example, double the distance and the signal decreases to 1/4. The extra decrease was thought to be due to absorption by the air and ground and earthbound objects such as vegetation and buildings. Moreover, short waves at night exhibited very confusing behavior. They could be louder than would be expected with no absorption at all, then could rapidly fade to almost nothing. He concluded that this could only happen if direct waves were interfering with waves reflected by some upper layer of the atmosphere. The two path lengths would be different, and thus signals following different paths could combine at the reception point to enhance or degrade each other. During the winter of 1914-1915, he performed all-night experiments using 1,500 and 500-meter waves, expecting to find that variations observed at 1,500 would all be present at 500 too, but not the converse, given the 3-to-1 wavelength ratio. His results seemed to support that theory. He suggested additional experiments and noted something we take for granted today, that cases where the wavelengths seem to skip an intervening station are of especial interest and should be carefully noted. A number of well-proven cases are on record where signals have been more audible at, say, 700 miles than at 350 miles, the sender and two receivers all in a line. It is difficult to explain such cases except by the action of interfering reflections. Taylor concluded that freak records for distance covered were probably not a valid way to rate the effectiveness of a station, since these occurrences were haphazard exceptions rather than demonstrations of consistent or inherent capability. Other theories explained bending of waves among favorable paths, speculating about the effects of sunlight and that decreased ionization of the air at night was probably responsible for the improved propagation. They were right, but for the wrong reason. The shorter the wavelength, the greater the observed enhancement was at night. This was a hint of great things to come. Calls heard. For some time, QST had been printing lists of stations heard as reported by members around the country. Located towards the back of the magazine, at first mixed in with the letters to the editor, it was known as the Calls Heard section. Polling indicated there was very strong support for continuing the practice, many finding it quite useful in judging the effectiveness of their stations along various paths from month to month. This was a time when establishing two-way contact was itself quite challenging. Thus, just hearing another amateur signal was useful information to convey by other means, for example via QST, back to the transmitting station's owner. The editor noticed many queer things that could be inferred by these lists in regard to fading. The most prominent question was, why were stations further distant heard more reliably than ones closer in? And why could a station at the foot of a high mountain hear stations 800 miles beyond it? This made no sense at all, for waves were propagating along the ground. Noticing the effects of ionospheric propagation, amateurs did not yet understand it. A very early Calls Heard section included a letter from 16-year-old Fred Terman, misspelled Texman, in QST. Terman would later become professor of electrical engineering at Stanford University, author of seminal textbooks on radio engineering, and one of the founders of Silicon Valley. In the midst of ever-expanding range, a QST editor, probably Maxim, asked, "Where are we bound? That is, where is message relaying taking us?" Licensed amateurs were then 5,000 strong in the U.S. They held regular traffic handling schedules. Some stations had as much as $1,000 invested in their stations, equivalent to nearly $18,000 in 2013. 1,000 miles was now being covered with a kilowatt or less, using 200 to 300 meter wavelength, something newly possible for 20 or 30 of us every night. He also wondered how the presence of inexpensive or free communications, neglecting the cost of equipment between citizens, would affect the telephone business, and what new and ever better equipment and technology would result from the demand for amateur wireless apparatus. Would other countries stop suppressing amateur operation as they were doing now? Finally, he noted, and last of all, we wonder if you and I some night in the future will sit in our little room and chat with another fellow in Germany or France while we listen to what is going on between a couple of fellows, one in Brazil and the other in Honolulu. We realize this last is a pretty good wonder, but if we advance as much in the next 10 years as we have in the past 10, it will be something to confidently expect. And 9DC offered his own poetic take on propagation and pleasure in operating. As I sit here upon my hard-bottomed chair, with receptors screwed to my auditory organs, I seem to be possessed of a superhuman position. In fact, it is like flirting with spirits, chasing unimaginable demons of the firmament, and kidding the devil. Indeed, I listen to the mouth of the world give forth its grievances of a day with ears like those of a god. As the hours grow smaller, the green-shaded filament before my orbs appears to grow more subdued, but more effective with its tormenting rays. I am surrounded by the playthings of spirits. They generate a flaming liquid. It is hot. It cracks as it flows. It renders the air asunder as it passes over a non-metallic circuit, spark gap. It jumps forth from its origin upon every airline of the earth. It dies no sooner than born, but how far it has traveled in its short career, no one knows. Indeed, the most delightful and fascinating thought comes from the anticipation reaching some distant hamlet or city. 9 DC. Nearly a century later, this anticipation remains a source of delight and fascination for many hams. Included in this material are quotes from the following: L. Windsor, Radio Communications by the Amateurs, QST, June 1916, page 141. A. H. Taylor, Transmission Variations, QST, August 1916, page 189. The Propagation of Wireless Waves, QST, opening article, September 1916, page 235. Where Are We Bound? Editorial, QST, February 1917, page 36. 9 DC, QRM, Radio Communication by the Amateurs, QST, March 1917, page 45. With a tip of the TWIAR hat to Chris Cadella, W9PA, for the use of his website materials, Ham Radio History, A Century of Amateur Radio, Ham's Organizations, Events, Inventions. I'm Will Rogers, K5WLR, reporting for This Week in Amateur Radio.
You are listening to This Week in Amateur Radio, available to download as a podcast from anywhere on the web podcasts are available.
Foundations of Amateur Radio. The other day I was sitting on the couch lounging about when I came up with an idea, and there and then I picked up a circuit board, soldered down 100 or so components, and built a noise-cancelling gadget, all within about an hour, right there, on my couch. Yeah, that didn't happen. Least of all, my soldering skills are not up to scratch, never mind the couch. I did, however, build a noise-cancelling circuit, on my couch, in about an hour. But no soldering iron was hurt and the room didn't smell of chicken afterwards. Instead, I used GNU radio to put together a series of blocks that allow me to apply noise cancelling to a signal. How does this work? Well, imagine a signal mixed together with the negative version of that signal. Think of it as swapping positive and negative, if you like. If you mix two identical signals together, one of them inverted, you end up with nothing, because they cancel each other out. Where one is high, the other is opposite and low, and vice versa. Mix a high signal with a low signal, you end up halfway. If they're the same but opposite, halfway is zero. Hearing nothing is not helpful, but what if the two signals were slightly different? Let's say one is connected to a proper 10-meter antenna and the other is connected to an antenna that picks up local noise. We'll call the antenna on 10 meters the signal, and the local noise antenna the noise. If you mix these together, you end up with a signal and noise combined. But if you invert the noise signal, you can at least theoretically filter out the noise that's common to both antennas. Now, I did say theoretically, and that's because while it sounds simple, it's far from it. Unless you have a special radio, the two signals are not coming from the same device and won't really be identical where it matters. For example, let's call it the volume or gain of one might be higher than the other. One might arrive slightly later than the other if the coax isn't the same length or the electronics in both radios are different. There are other things too, but let's just stay with this for a moment. You could amplify or attenuate one or both signals to make them the same or similar levels. You could change the phase. Think of it as the time when a signal starts and synchronize the two signals in time manually. Of course, whilst you're doing this inside GNU Radio, the computer is doing some serious math, which takes time to make these changes, which introduces further delays you'll also need to account for. Building it was simple. Testing it, much less so. After coming to grips with the USB port on my computer, which for reasons best known to the manufacturer, Apple, switches off ports that are in use, I managed to get two RTL SDR dongles connected and working. This involved removing GNU Radio, which was installed using a tool called Homebrew, then installing it instead using Radio Conda. Twice, since the first time the installer failed with an error. Actually 3 times, because the failed installation left all manner of rubbish behind, so that needed to be removed. Then I had to disconnect my keyboard and trackpad, because for reasons only known to the manufacturer, the same one, they won't play nice if there's an RTL SDR dongle plugged into the USB-C hub. I finally got this running, which in turn involved figuring out what the GNU radio device arguments look like for a locally connected dongle. In case you're wondering, it's RTL equals 0 for the first one and RTL equals 1 for the second. Clearly this project is living up to its name, Bold Yak. Now I can invert a signal, I can amplify and attenuate it, change the phase, shift the frequency, swap the I and Q, do a complex conjugate, and have a user interface that can change these settings as required. I'm going to ignore the hour of my life I'm not getting back to understand how variables, parameters, and user interface items hang together and how they interact. It's logical, but it takes a bit to wrap your head around it, and I'm a software developer, so I don't envy you if you're not. Anyway, I tuned to a local FM broadcast radio station and couldn't make any noise go away. I then discovered that my noise antenna was picking up the station just fine, so that didn't help. Then I swapped radios. Actually, I just swapped the 0 and the 1 in the device argument fields and tried again. In the process, I discovered how you can create a so-called hierarchical block in GNU Radio, and, to my delight, also discovered that there is one that can have a user interface. So I can make a standalone block that has a user interface that I can use in another project, which is how I intend Bold Yak to function. So, changing stations, I could finally hear noise, but still no reduction. Then I realized that I was using FM, not single sideband, so I started hunting for an SSB decoder, but had to abandon ship to go and do life. Overnight, I realized that if everything went to plan, the 2 FM signals should have cancelled each other out, making silence, which they didn't, despite my efforts. So, at this point, I have a thing that can alter noise and mix it with a signal for the purposes of noise reduction. That it doesn't work is potentially because I have not enough range in my adjustments, or too much range with not enough steps. Just as likely, it's because I'm missing some fundamental understanding somewhere. If you have any documentation I should read, please don't be shy. As life adventures go, I'm hooked, but it's not without shaving yaks, bold or otherwise. I'm Ono, Victor Kilo 6, Foxtrot Lima Alpha Bravo.
The first session of the ARRL Teachers Institute on Wireless Technology reached 9 New York City area educators, but the ripple effects will reach thousands of students. John Ross, KD8IDJ, is here with more in this report.
The session was held at the Staten Island Technical High School, home of a thriving and active amateur radio club. It was led in part by Everton Enriquez, KD2ZZT, an educator at the school and a TI graduate. In August of 2024, 49 of Enriquez's students earned their licenses. All 9 teachers came away with their amateur radio licenses if they didn't have one already, and the training, knowledge, and excitement to integrate amateur radio into their science, technology, engineering, and mathematics lessons. ARR Education and Learning Manager Steve Goodgame, K5ATA, says the results seen in hundreds of classrooms across the country speak for themselves. Amateur radio is a great platform upon which students can learn and experiment with STEM areas of instruction, said Goodgame. It allows students to participate in hands-on activities that give meaningful connections to lessons that would normally be abstract in the classroom. The ARRL Teachers Institute on Wireless Technology is funded entirely by donations to the ARR Education and Technology Fund. No member dues go towards the program. The success that teachers across America are seeing is the result of hundreds of donors trusting ARRL to invest in the future of the hobby through educating and inspiring the next generation of hams. The program is free to educators. Many of these success stories are highlighted in the Radio Waves publication. Radio Waves aims to showcase how educators and licensed class instructors are getting their students and local communities involved in ham radio. Editions may be read online, or members can sign up for a free email delivery. We're seeing the results of the work we put into this program. Young people are getting inspired, licensed, and active in amateur radio, said Goodgame. The time we commit to this will pay dividends to the hobby for generations to come. I'm John Ross, KD8IDJ.
Other sessions are planned for Texas and the Southeast during 2025. Interested educators are encouraged to apply. Learn more at www.arrl.org/TI.
A Falcon 9 rocket carrying 131 different payloads lifted off on the company's Transporter 12 mission from Vandenberg Space Force Base on January 14th. Included among the payloads were the amateur radio satellites Hades R, operated by AMSAT EA in Spain, and Paris T1, constructed by National Formosa University of Taiwan, among others. With so many payloads aboard, not all of the satellites will be released at once. Rather, releases will be spaced over a period of time. At this writing, there is no word yet on the successful deployment of Hades R. Further, the satellite will undergo several weeks of commissioning before the FEB repeater is opened for use. Hades R has a downlink frequency coordinated by the International Amateur Radio Union of 436.888 MHz. While FM voice is the primary mission, the downlink may sometimes include FSK data up to 1200 BPS, APRS up to 1200 BPS, FSK telemetry and experimental data up to 1600 BPS, or CW. The uplink will be 145.925 MHz. Modes will be FM voice without a subtone and FSK 200 BPS, AFSK, AX.25, APRS 1200, or 2400 BPS. Also launched on Transport 12 was Paris T1, a 3U CubeSat dedicated to receiving APRS signals on three major global frequencies, including 144.64 MHz, 144.39 MHz, and 144.8 MHz. The satellite will record the received signal strength indicator data for each received APRS packet and utilize a global navigation satellite system receiver to determine the CubeSat's orbit location during each signal reception. The received APRS data, RSSI values, and corresponding location data will be stored in the onboard computer memory for transmission to ground stations later. Students will also be extensively involved in the mission data analysis and will gain hands-on experience in understanding ionospheric propagation and its impact on terrestrial and satellite radio communications. The beacon packets shall not be encrypted and will be made public to the community via websites. Community participation will be encouraged through the online leaderboards and, for example, SatNog's network. Data format of Paris T1 health telemetry and payload raw data will also be published and welcome all amateurs to receive 436.85 MHz for packet data of AX25 protocol in 1200 BPS. Paris T1 also has an APRS digipeater to provide global amateur activities at the same frequencies of the ISS APRS channel of 145.825 MHz. 37 of the 131 payloads going up today belong to San Francisco company Planet, which operates 3 constellations of Earth-observing satellites. 36 of the 37 Planet craft are Super Dove CubeSats, shoebox-sized craft that collect images with a resolution of about 10 feet per pixel. The other one is Pelican 2, whose resolution is about 7 times sharper than that. SpaceX has launched a total of 13 rideshare missions to date, the 11 transporter flights, and 2 in a different program known as Bandwagon. Together, these missions have lofted about 1,100 payloads for more than 130 different customers, according to the Transporter 12 description.
You are listening to This Week in Amateur Radio, available worldwide as a podcast from our web at twiar.net.
Bruce Page, KK5DO, is here now with this week's AMSAT report. Bruce?
Thanks, John. AMSAT's Fox Plus will have a critical design review, or CDR, towards late May, according to Mike, K4MVM, AMSAT Fox Plus Systems Engineer, and launch of the newly designed 1U CubeSat is planned for late 2025. Also working on this project are Andrew, KA3WDW, the Mechanical Instructional Engineer, Cliff, KE8JAE, and Will, working on software, Leandra, AF1R, an electrical engineer and working on hardware, and Patrick, KB8DGC, a system engineer and PACSAT liaison. We will have more information about the satellite, the planned frequencies, and the date of launch as we get closer. This is Bruce Page, KK5DO. Back to you, John.
And thanks, Bruce, for that report.
It is time for this week's propagation and solar weather forecast. The sun has been moderately active this past week. The greater than 2 MeV solar particle event electron flux at geostationary orbit is expected to remain mostly at normal to moderate levels. A coronal hole high-speed stream is expected to arrive February 1st. Particle injection during this time will likely elevate the 2 MeV electron flux to high levels. Solar wind speeds have been at nominal levels and are expected to continue. There remains a slight chance for enhancement due to a weak coronal mass ejection associated with a Type 2 radio sweep off the west limb around January 28. Confidence in the arrival of this coronal mass ejection is low as modeling suggests arrival late January. The geomagnetic field has been quiet to unsettled with a slight chance for active conditions on January 31st, due to possible influence from the CME. The most notable effects will be from the high-speed stream from the positive polarity coronal hole that is expected to become fully geo-effective on February 1st. The 10.7 cm radio flux and geomagnetic indices will be 150 on January 30th and 31st, 145 on February 1st, and 150 on February 2nd.
In radio sport this week, many great contest opportunities. January 31st, the UKE ICC 80-meter contest, that's CW. February 1st and 2nd, a load of contests here. The LABRERS Digi contest, that's digital. The VHF UHF Vermont QSO party, CW Digital and Phone. Also on February 1st and 2nd, the 1010 International Winter Contest, single sideband, that's phone of course. February 1st and 2nd, the European Union DX contest, CW and Phone. The F9AA Cup, that's CW. February 1st and 2nd as well, Mexico RTTY International Contest, digital. The Minnesota QSO Party, CW and Phone, and digital. The FYBO Winter QRP Sprint, CW Phone and digital. February 1st and 2nd, the AGCW Straight Key Party, CW. And on February 2nd as well, the British Columbia QSO Party, that is CW and Phone. Also on February 2nd, it's the North American Sprint, that is CW. Upcoming section, state, and division conventions, February 7th through the 9th, the Orlando Hamcation hosting the ARRL Southeastern Division Convention. That's in Orlando, Florida. On February 8th, it's the Hendricks County Hamfest hosting the ARRL Indiana Section Convention in Danville, Indiana. February 14th through the 15th, the Yuma Handfest hosting the ARRL Southwestern Division Convention in Yuma, Arizona. And on February 22nd, HamCon hosting the ARRL Vermont State Convention. That's in Colchester, Vermont. And don't forget to search the ARRL Hamfest calendar and convention database to find events in your area.
Time for a few short amateur radio stories this week. And first up is President George Washington's 293rd birthday, which will be celebrated by the Mount Vernon Amateur Radio Club, K4US, Alexandria, Virginia, on February 15, from 1500 UTC to 2000 UTC, and on February 16th from 1500 UTC until 1600 UTC. Club members will be operating from the Mount Vernon Greenhouse on the original grounds of the former plantation of George Washington and his wife Martha. Frequencies include 7.042, 7.242, 14.042, and 14.242 megahertz. QSL cards and additional information are available by contacting the Mount Vernon Amateur Radio Club, Box 7234, Alexandria, Virginia, 22307. The Mount Vernon Amateur Radio Club is an ARRL-affiliated club. Next up is changes occurring in the ARRL Utah section. Brett Pruitt, K7DBD, has been named as the new section manager of the ARRL Utah section. He has previously served as the section emergency coordinator and has been active in the leadership of his local amateur radio emergency service group. Pruitt has been instrumental in expanding the use of AREDN networks within Utah. Pruitt was appointed to the role effective February 1 of 2025. The change comes as current section manager Pat Milan, N7PAT, reassigned from the role for health reasons. Milan has served in that role since 2021. And lastly, the Shanghai Coast radio station, XSG, will host a global amateur radio special event on February 12 and 13. The station will celebrate its 120th anniversary and World Radio Day from 0000 UTC on February 12 to 2400 UTC on February 13. All contacts with SXG will be crossband contacts in Morse code, and XSG will operate on its authorized frequencies outside of the amateur radio band. Amateur radio operators making contact will operate within their own allocated amateur frequencies. XSG transmission frequencies are 4105, 6780, 8502, and 12871.5 kilohertz. XSG will receive frequencies on 3521.3 through 3526.3, 7021.3 through 7026.3, 10121.3 through 10126.3, 14021.3 through 14026.3, and 2120.3 through 21026.3. For more information, email hadt@shhadt.com.
Ward Silver N0AX dropped us a line about the NCJ North American CW Sprint on February 2nd, 2025. Imagine a weekend without a single full-bore pro football game. No more pregame jabber hours, no amazing on-screen graphics and gadgets, no breathless halftime reports or injury updates. What is a right-thinking person to do? Well, how about the CW Sprint? The NCJ North American CW Sprint runs on Saturday evening, February 2nd, 2025, from 0000 to 0359 UTC, or as they say on TV, 7 p.m. Eastern, 6 p.m. Central. Logs are due on February 9th, and complete rules and regulations are available at their website. Teams of up to 5 persons can be registered on the contest website at any time, right up to the start of the contest, so let the funny names begin to flow. While the only multipliers are NA countries, U.S. states, and Canadian provinces, contacts from anywhere count for QSO points. There are lots of opportunities for DX friends around the world to make a few QSOs and set a record for their country. And as a reminder, the March RTTY Sprint is March 9th. Thanks, Ward, for the information.
2 days in April will be devoted to getting the best out of using VHF, UHF, and weak signal microwaves to operate at the Southeastern VHF Conference in Clarksville, Tennessee. Organizers are looking for papers and presentations that cover equipment, construction projects, station accessories, roving, DXing, and the digital modes. Anything relevant to weak signals operating on either an operational or technical level. In general, the conference is not accepting topics on FM or packet repeaters or packet unless the subject relates to weak signal operations. The deadline for submissions is February 15th and should be emailed to Mike Stipik, KC4RI at kc4ri@att.net. The conference will be held in April 4th and 5th. For details on acceptable formats for submissions, follow the link svhfs.org/WP/.
You are listening to This Week in Amateur Radio, available to download as a podcast from anywhere on the web. Podcasts are available.
A space twofer took place early this past Wednesday morning, 2 lunar missions for the price of 1 rocket launch. A SpaceX Falcon 9 lifted off from NASA's Kennedy Space Center in Florida at 1:11 a.m. Eastern Time, carrying the Blue Ghost lander built by Firefly Aerospace of Austin, Texas, and the Resilience lander from iSpace of Japan. Why did two moon landers share one rocket? That was a result of fortuitous scheduling by SpaceX and not something that was planned by Firefly or iSpace. Firefly had purchased a Falcon 9 launch to send its Blue Ghost lander to the moon. At the same time, iSpace, to save on costs for the mission, had asked SpaceX for a rideshare, that is, hitching a ride as a secondary payload on a rocket launch that was going roughly in the right direction to get its Resilience lander to the moon. That turned out to be Blue Ghost's trip. It was a no-brainer to put them together, Juliana Scheiman, the director for NASA's science missions at SpaceX, said during a news conference this week. After the Falcon 9 rocket reached orbit, the second stage fired again for a minute so it could deploy Blue Ghost in an elliptical orbit around Earth about an hour after launch. The rocket stage fired once more, for just a second, to adjust the orbit for the deployment of Resilience, about 1.5 hours after launch. On Wednesday morning, Firefly and iSpace announced that their spacecraft successfully turned on, established communications with ground stations on Earth, and were operating as expected. According to AMSAT DL, the German amateur satellite organization, the Firefly Space Blue Ghost mission includes the lunar GNSS receiver experiment with the goal of demonstrating GNSS-based positioning, navigation, and timing at the moon. LUGRE will build on the legacy of prior missions in the Space Service volume, including the initial experiments by AMSAT on Oscar 40 P3D satellite and others.
These days, anything with copper in it is expensive, and if you doubt that, walk into any Home Depot electrical department where the wire is locked up tighter than Fort Knox. Coaxial cable is particularly expensive, which is a pity for hams and other radio enthusiasts, since it's about the only thing you can use for antenna feed lines. Or is it? Steve, VE6WZ, has found a way to use ordinary Cat6 Ethernet cable for antenna feed lines. It seems pretty clever. As he points out, Ethernet cables are designed to handle frequencies that coincide nicely with most of the interesting amateur radio bands, and their insertion losses are acceptably low, especially for Cat6 cable. The twisted pairs are also a balanced system, and that's good for rejecting common mode noise. Cat6 cable also has 4 pairs of conductors, allowing you to feed multiple antennas with one cable, or to distribute power to amplifiers or switches along with the antenna feed. The downside? Well, Cat6 conductor pairs have a characteristic impedance of around 100 ohms, which isn't quite a match for 50 ohm feedline impedance usually expected by ham radios. Also, relatively small wires probably aren't up to the job of carrying much current, limiting their use to feedlines for receive-only antennas. That works for Steve since he uses Cat6 to support his massive beverage antenna farm. By the way, beverage antennas are non-resident horizontal antennas that live close to the ground and point in the direction of the signal, rather than broadside to the signal, with a resonant antenna like a dipole. Each antenna in his farm has a transimpedance amplifier that needs to be powered, plus switching relays so he can, in turn, turn on the correct antennas for the signals he wants to receive. He describes the amps in detail in a video, along with custom impedance matching transformers that he uses. Coax will probably still be the cable of choice, though, for most feedline applications, but it's nice to know there are alternatives, and who knows, if you stick to QRP work, maybe Cat6 could even be used for transmitting.
This story takes us to Greece, where the Mount Athos SV1GA/Alpha de-expedition team halted their activation shortly after it got underway, amid challenges over whether they had permission to be there. The DX entity has been a World Heritage Site since 1988 and is listed as number 28 on the Clublog DXCC list. The team went on the air for their planned 10-day operation in late January to mark the 50th anniversary of the first amateur radio activation there. The 5-member team was led by 2 of the operators from the original Mount Athos activation, Marty, OH2BH, and Aris, SV1GA. The other team members were Adrian, KO8SCA, Gabby, YO8WW, and Nico, OH2GEK. Their signal went silent within a day, however, after they said they received a letter from the Mount Athos holy community regarding the DXpedition's right to operate at the site, which is home to about 2,000 monks in 20 monasteries. On Wednesday, January 29th, the team issued a public statement through Bernie McClinney, W3UR, saying that they planned to provide authorities with whatever information is needed for the issue to be clarified, saying that they would wait for the relevant authorities to meet and review their case. On Thursday, January 30th, Marty released a public statement announcing that the team was leaving the island while awaiting a decision by local authorities who had issued the hams their permit. An earlier statement from the team prior to their activation had been one of hope. The team said in a statement, "We would like to think that this Mount Athos activation is just a first step in opening the doors to other teams to activate this desired amateur radio entity. Our goal is to show that amateur radio DXpeditions have no impact on the monastic life of the Holy Mountain. On the contrary, it creates goodwill and allows the 3 million amateurs around the world to see this beautiful and serene place with different eyes."
For as long as there has been an understanding of electricity and radio waves, people have been experimenting with these technologies and advancing the state of the art. As a result, the world has moved from wired telegraphy to the tube radios to telephones, forward a century to GPS and high-speed digital communication devices that fit right in your pocket. Advances made by amateur radio experimenters have propelled the work of NASA, satellites, television, the internet, and every communications company in existence today. People fiddling with radios have pushed forward technological advances around the world time and time again. Yet the people making these efforts, doing these feats, aren't always the best at documenting and preserving their work for the future. That's where Internet Archive comes in. Welcome to the Digital Library of Amateur Radio and Communications, or DLARC. The DLARC is a project of the Internet Archive, and its job is to find and preserve this rich history of radio and communications. DLARC collects resources related to amateur radio, satellite communications, television, shortwave radio, pirate radio, experimental communications, and related communications. In the 2 years since the project launched, DLARC has preserved thousands of magazines and journals, manuals, product catalogs, radio programs, and conference proceedings. These materials were scattered worldwide, often inaccessible and in obsolete formats. DLARC have digitized material that was on paper, cassette tape, reel-to-reel tape, CD-ROMs, DVDs, digitized video from 16mm film, VHS, U-matic, Betacam, and even more obscure video formats. They've built a collection of more than 140,000 items and made them available to the world. Researchers, academics, and hobbyists use the library to learn from the rich history of this 100-year-old hobby.
The Lake Placid Olympic Museum in northern New York State is receiving a donation that is more than just images and memories. It has been 45 years since the Winter Olympics were held in New York State's Adirondack Mountains. That year, the athletes weren't the only ones making an Olympian effort. 21 amateur radio operators followed the 1,000-mile route of the traditional Olympic flame as it was carried north along the east coast of the U.S., starting on the 31st of January 1980. Along the way, hams in each local community helped with safety and logistics as the torch relay team passed through. To mark the Olympics anniversary, one member of that team, Bob Josewhite, WA3PZO, has donated some 100 magazines and newspaper articles documenting the 10-day run itself and amateur radio's involvement. There are also 350 35mm slides that are being digitized so the museum can add these images to their collection too. The hams themselves have more than those long-ago memories. Their volunteer work earned each a medal that keeps the memory burning as bright as that Olympic flame.
You are listening to This Week in Amateur Radio, available as an on-demand stream from Spotify, Deezer, and wherever podcasts are available.
The 76th Annual International DX Convention, sponsored by the Northern California DX Club, will be held at the Visalia Conference Center in Visalia, California, from April 11th through the 13th, 2025. This year's theme is Back to Basics, an opportunity to learn effective tips and techniques to work DX and have fun doing it. The convention will feature a contest forum, DX Forum, Contest Academy, DX Academy, and the all-new full-day Next Generation DXing program. There are seminars for everyone, from the beginning DXer to the seasoned pro. The registration fee for all youth up to age 18 has been waived and allows free access to the convention programs, forums, and the exhibit hall. Meals, raffle tickets, and the bus tour are not included with the free registration. Additionally, shirt orders must be made by 0000 UTC on February 27th, and the convention pre-registration ends at 0000 UTC on April 3rd.
An ambitious project in Canada hopes to develop a mesh network to link repeaters that accommodate several digital modes, hoping to combine the best features of such digital networks as Ham1, AREDN, and New Packet Radio. Developers in Canada are starting development of a mesh network that will operate on the 70-centimeter band. Writing in the newsletter Zero Retries, Martin Alcock, VE6VH, said the project is being designed to link repeaters using RF, and it'll include digital voice modes, data transfers, messaging, and a data networking layer. The project is called IP400, short for Intelligent Protocol 400. It has the support of the Alberta Digital Radio Communications Society, and it's looking for contributors familiar with the C and C++ languages. Free open source code is being used in the development. IP400 is intended to operate on amateur frequencies between 420 and 450 megahertz. Martin said that unlike conventional analog links, a digital mesh platform will be capable of carrying compressed digital video as well as compressed audio and telemetry. He writes, the first step is to get a simple chat and beaconing application running to experiment with the technology. From there, we can layer on other features and frame types and then consider moving into the repeater world.
Scientists believe that one key to predicting dangerous solar flares may rest in a clue they found in the sun's coronal loops. Analyzing images captured at NASA's Solar Dynamics Observatory, researchers say they've identified a telltale flickering that seems to be a tip-off that dangerous solar flares are soon to follow. The scientists detected the flickering in the coronal loop of shining plasma. This was actually ultraviolet light at specific wavelengths, and it occurred before the sun shot massive bursts of electromagnetic radiation, which we know as solar flares. The researchers viewed the phenomenon just before 50 of such solar flares. Their findings were presented to the American Astronomical Society in Maryland in January 15th. The scientists believe that what they observed may provide a way to develop more dependable forecasts of space weather. They believe the predictions based on this observation can offer an accuracy of 60 to 80% for flares. The biggest of these geomagnetic disturbances can disrupt power grids, satellite orbits, rail lines, and global positioning systems. More accurate forecasts of space weather would also be welcomed by amateur radio operators and people chasing the northern lights.
Satellite enthusiasts in Switzerland are inviting everyone to help pay tribute to a radio operator who was in the vanguard of making QSOs via those satellites in orbit. AMSAT Switzerland proudly uses the call sign HB9RG as a way to honor Hans Rudolf Lauber. Hans became a silent key in 2017 at the age of 92, but until then, the call sign belonged to this innovative Swiss amateur who completed the first amateur radio satellite QSO in March of 1965. The contact with Alphonse Haring, DL6EZA, was completed via the Oscar 11 satellite. Hans Rudolf will be honored again by satellite enthusiasts in March when AMSAT HB hosts the Hans Rudolf Lauber HB9RG Memorial Trophy event. In the spirit of this avid DXer, the trophy will recognize contacts made over significant distances during the 2-week between March 3rd and the 16th. Contacts must be made using only low Earth orbit, medium Earth orbit, and high Earth orbit satellites. For more details and full explanation of the rules, visit AMSAT Switzerland on the web at amsat-hb.org.
A popular online ham radio magazine is returning for readers in Ireland and now around the world. Ham Radio Ireland is back. After a period of inactivity late last year, the free, independent, downloadable newsletter resumed online publication in late January. Shortly after its creators launched its predecessor, the Connacht Regional Newsletter, in 2022, they realized it held appeal beyond its initial readership in Western Ireland, and it was renamed Ham Radio Ireland. Authors volunteered sharing their expertise on QRP, satellite operation, VHF and UHF, home construction, keyboard modes, and other topics. According to Steve Wright, EI5DD editorial contributions eventually sowed to a trickle, making continued publication a challenge. By last September, production had stopped. John Tuberett, EI3HQB from Collective Communications, and Steve Wright, EI5DD, are on the editorial team to revive the magazine in a new format. Initially, the best site for downloads will be via the Facebook page of Ham Radio Ireland. Links will soon be available on other social media platforms. Authors anywhere in the world are welcome to send stories and pictures relevant to ham radio and their experiences. They can be sent directly to Steve at wright14@gmail.com. That's WRIGHT14@gmail.com.
The Radio Society of Great Britain exams team is pleased to announce the publication of a revised version of syllabus version 1.6. This update is known as version 1.6b. The revisions addresses feedback received from the community since the publication of version 1.6a. The companion document summarizes the changes made to the syllabus, which include moving some material from licensing in Section 1 to the more appropriate Section 7, which focuses on operating. There are no significant changes to the number and content of learning points. Version 1.6b will be in effect for exams held from April 1st, 2025. The RSGB's weekly news broadcast, GB2RS, is celebrating its 70th anniversary this year. As part of the celebrations, special call sign GB70RS is active throughout the year. The call sign is being operated by radio amateurs who help to deliver GB2RS each week and could include newsreaders and RSGB headquarters staff. You can listen out for operators on all modes and all bands with activity taking place at any time, although you are particularly likely to hear them before and after the GB2RS broadcasts. Find out more via the GB70RS page at qrz.com. If you'd like to learn more about the weekly news service and other celebratory activities taking place this year, watch January's Tonight at 8 webinar. The January 2025 edition of Radcom Basics is now available on the RSGB website for members to read. The Radcom Basics is aimed at new licensees and amateurs who want to refresh their skills and knowledge. Among others, this edition includes articles that provide advice on constructing a kit, options for installing a suitable 40-meter band antenna in a small garden, and a discussion on what you need to power a portable station. RSGB headquarters will be closing at 12 p.m. on Friday, February 7th, 2025, as RGB staff will be attending the funeral of their colleague, Gillian Cool. To allow time for preparation for the GB2RS news script, the deadline for the GB2RS news broadcast on Sunday, February 9th, 2025, has been brought forward. Please send details of all your news and events to radcom@rsgb.org.uk by 10 a.m. on Wednesday, February 5th, 2025.
We pause for stations along the network to identify. We are This Week in Amateur Radio, available as a stream to your favorite digital device on Spotify, TuneIn.com, Overcast, iHeartMedia, and wherever you download your podcasts.
The RSGB is looking for an assistant editor to join the team that produces its suite of Radcom publications. The successful candidate will be involved in everything from magazine production and sub-editing to writing articles and planning content. You will be a core part of the editorial team, working closely with and being managed by the Radcom managing editor. Reporting to the managing editor, you will commission articles and liaise with authors and their articles, sub-edit copies sent in by contributors and regular columnists, help to guide the content of Radcom Basics and Radcom Plus supplements, be a part of the team that puts together a weekly news script, answer queries from members of the Society on Technical and Amateur Radio Licensing Matters, help develop the entire coordinated Radcom portfolio, including new media opportunities. You will be proficient in the use of the Microsoft Office suite of applications. Knowledge and experience of using Adobe InDesign and Adobe Photoshop are extremely desirable. You must be positive, enthusiastic about technology, and have an excellent command of English, a good eye for detail, and be able to work to exacting standards, often under pressure. A wide range of radio and electronic knowledge, including amateur radio, is desirable. This staff position is based at RSGB headquarters near Bedford, although an element of working from home could be discussed. The salary is negotiable depending upon relevant qualifications and experience. For an informal chat about the role, call the Radcom managing editor via radcom@rsgb.org.uk.
The 29.8 meter parabolic antenna at the Australian Overseas Telecommunications Commission station has come back to life again after nearly 40 years spent in decommissioning limbo. This parabolic dish antenna shares an illustrious history, together with the older 12.8 meter Casshorn antenna, in that, together, they assisted with many NASA missions over the decades. These not only include the Apollo 11 moon landing with the small antenna, but joined by the larger parabolic dish in 1969, the station performed tracking duty for NASA's ESA and many other missions. Yet in 1987, the station was decommissioned, with scrapping mostly averted due to the site being designated a heritage site with a local VK6 museum. In 2022, the 20.98 meter parabolic dish antenna was purchased by ThothX Australia, who together with the rest of ThothX's worldwide presence will be integrating the latest addition into a satellite tracking system that seems to have the interest of various military clients. ThothX's mission statement reads, "We aim at contributing to space safety and sustainability while meeting the needs of industry, academia, and government departments and agencies." Putting this decommissioned dish back into service wasn't simply a matter of flipping a few switches. Having sat mostly neglected for decades, it requires extensive refurbishing. But the most recent milestone demonstrates that the dish is capable of locking onto satellites. This opens the way for a top-to-bottom refurbishment, the installation of new equipment, and also a lick of paint on the dish itself, a process that will take many years, but beats watching such a historic landmark rust away by many light years. This antenna is a veteran of many notable NASA missions, including the Apollo 11 moon landing. Although it is not yet ready for prime time again, ABC News Australia reported in December 2024 that the dish had received its first signal in 40 years, sent as a test from a geostationary object.
Hamcation organizers have named 3 award recipients whose accomplishments will be recognized and celebrated in Orlando, Florida next month. David Jordan, AA4KN, has been selected to receive the Carol Perry Educator of the Year Award. Heather Anderson, W8GEM, and David Anderson, K1AN, will share the Gordon West Ambassador of the Year Award. In his various responsibilities with ARIS, amateur radio on the International Space Station, David has been responsible for coordinating QSOs with his ISS astronauts for students around the world. His is a function that includes helping select and schedule the schools as well as helping train and assist with technical operations. He is an AMSAT member who mentors students, giving them an opportunity to learn more about radio contacts via satellite through the so-called teach-ins at the elementary and middle school level. Heather and David are members of the Yavapai Amateur Radio Club W7YRC in Arizona, where youngsters in the Youth Radio Club, known for their leadership and training and projects. The two maintain a strong presence at the library summer programs. Youth Field Days have an involvement in science, technology, engineering, arts, and mathematics, also known as STEAM. The awards will be presented during Hamcation, which takes place from the 7th to the 9th of February.
And some sad news to report this week, as a noted CW contester and prominent YL in the international community has become a silent key. A ham since 1975, Roselle Zinker, DL3KWR, died on the 15th of January, according to an announcement by the Scandinavian Young Ladies Radio Amateurs, one of 6 YL groups she belonged to. Roselle was an amateur who loved to combine travel with being on the air and had made use of 70 different call signs in 22 countries that she visited, often with her husband Hardy, DL3KWF. She had also traveled for about 20 years to participate in the international YL meetings of clubs in New Zealand, Australia, the United States, Japan, and Scandinavia. She was a member of the Russian CW Club, the Professional Radio Operators CW Club, and the Croatian Telegraphy Club. Roselle was primarily a CW operator, but tried to bring a personal touch to many of her QSOs. Writing on her personal webpage, dl3kwr.de, she said that CW is not as impersonal as it may seem to some. She quoted the small messages that she would send to others within the CW contest community that would offer the simple, heartfelt greeting. Nice to meet you again. Roselle was in her 80s.
Keeping the amateur radio community around the world informed, you are listening to This Week in Amateur Radio. Available worldwide as a podcast from our web at twiar.net.
According to the South African Radio League, the DXpedition to Bouvet Island next year is ready to go forward. Team 3Y0K plans to leave Cape Town, South Africa on February 1st, 2026 for 36 days on the remote sub-Antarctic island, the 10th most wanted DXCC entity on the club log list. The team announced that it has signed a contract with Ice Tugs, an Iceland-based company that will transport them to the island by boat. Contracts have also been signed with Ultimate Aviation of Cape Town to provide the team with a helicopter, 2 pilots, and a mechanic. Costing an estimated $1.6 million in U.S. currency, the DXpedition will have a team of between 18 and 24 operators. Its financial support includes donations, as well as grants from the Northern California DX Foundation. The team said on its website that it considered the signing of the contracts with both companies to be a major milestone for the DXpedition.
The story of the World War II codebreakers at Bletchley Park near Milton Keynes, the cracking of the German Enigma and Lorentz cipher machines, and the role of supreme mathematicians such as Alan Turing is increasingly well known. However, the role of the voluntary interceptors is equally important but more obscure. Prior to the outbreak of World War I in August 1914, many of the techniques to be used in later years for radio communications had already been invented. During the interwar years, amateur radio enthusiasts began to emerge in the United Kingdom, and by 1922 there were 6,986 wireless licenses issued to receive transmissions and 286 giving permission to transmit. Upon the outbreak of World War II, the Radio Security Service, or RSS, was established. The service, which began as a branch of MI5, was formed to listen to radio airwaves and detect illicit wireless communications within the UK. Later, the work included interception of Axis diplomatic and military signals. In September 1939, all private radio equipment was impounded. The General Post Office operated 3 direction-finding stations, but did not have suitable equipment to monitor for intelligence traffic. So ordinary citizens who were not conscripted and were proficient in Morse code were recruited as secret listeners and allowed radio receivers. The majority were men, but there were also a few women, including Nell Corey, G2YL, and Olive Marler, G3GH. They were amateur radio operators and shortwave listening enthusiasts, skilled at receiving very weak and difficult to decipher signals. Their family and relatives had no idea of the work they were to engage in. Some never knew until many decades later. One of the estimated 1,700 voluntary interceptors was Bob King, G3ASE. He was a teenage amateur radio ham. Like many, he was a member of the Radio Society of Great Britain and interested in radio receiver technology. He was 16 when a military officer arrived at his home. Agreeing to help the war effort, he was required to sign the Official Secrets Act in the presence of his father due to his age. His father was then asked to leave the room, and the officer explained the work. Each voluntary interceptor was allocated a specific band to listen on and given general instructions. They were not allowed to transmit. The detail, sound, or tone of the overheard communication, whether it was Morse code or a hum, and the direction of the signal was recorded on special log sheets. These were posted to the RSS, addressed to Box 25, Barnet, Hertz. By 1941, the RSS were receiving about 10,000 log sheets a day. Through patient sorting, collation, and analysis of the logs from different volunteer interceptors, omissions in a received transmission might be filled in to complete the whole message. Similarly, the location of the operative sending the radio message could be identified through triangulation. The information was then sent on to the codebreakers at Bletchley Park. One of the greatest successes of the VIs was the identification of German Abwehr communications via detected short, rather odd messages that sounded like amateur radio. At first, these messages were dismissed as transmissions by German amateur radio hams. Later, it was realized that the messages, with an unusual 3-letter call sign and 5-letter groups of code, were in fact the communications of Hitler's innermost spy network. The Abwehr, the Nazis' military intelligence, believed if they disguised their messages as those sent by amateur radio hams, they would evade notice and therefore detection. In an interview with the BBC, King recalled, "We knew it wasn't Allied Army Air Force. We knew it was German or Italian. Various things gave that away, but it was disguised in such a form that it looked a bit like radio amateur transmission. We knew it was highly important. Everything was marked top secret, but only many years later we discovered that it was German Secret Service we were listening to." The Germans never realized their ruse had been discovered, and the Allies were reading these signals. A hazard of the work of the volunteer interceptors was the suspicion of their neighbors. They worked from home, and with a tall radio mast, it was not unusual to be reported as a possible enemy spy, or worse, accused of being a coward for not enlisting. Of course, the secret listeners could say nothing of their working from home. Eventually, the authorities in 1941 issued the VIs with a uniform of the Royal Observer Corps. In the case of Olive Marler, to ward off suspicious and prying eyes, a large aviary was constructed in front of her dining room for added privacy. Marler received the British Empire Medal in 1946 for exceptional service rendered during the war. She was the only VI to detect a signal one night giving the location of German U-boats being loaded in French inland waters. This intercept enabled the RAF to bomb the base, destroying the submarines at a time when the U-boats were having a deadly impact on Allied food and supply shipping convoys. In 1941, the work of the RSS was moved under the auspices of MI6. While MI5 occasionally releases files, MI6 never declassifies its records, and it is partly for this reason and because records were destroyed at the end of the war, that so little is known about the identity of the secret listeners. More information about the volunteer interceptors may be found at the RSGB National Radio Center at Bletchley Park website.
And finally this week, over on the Save It for Parts YouTube channel, Gabe Eberson, KL1FI, has uploaded a new video showing how he's hacking an old motorized Winegard RV satellite dish for tracking low Earth orbit satellites, such as the NOAA and Meteor weather satellites, as well as the U.S. military's DMSP system. The motorized RV satellite dish was originally intended for tracking TV satellites, but by connecting to the serial port on the control unit, Gabe is able to control the satellite dish through his own code. Gabe reports in this video, "I'm creating a motorized satellite tracker for S-band signals." S-band includes NOAA weather satellites and the U.S. military's DMSP system. "I'm using a Winegard brand traveler antenna designed for use on campers and recreational vehicles. It has a built-in 3-axis motor system for pointing at TV satellites, but I wanted to use it for tracking satellites closer to Earth. Since a low-orbit satellite like NOAA 18 or DMSP passes overhead in about 10 minutes, I need to move the dish faster and more precisely than it was intended for. This project is still ongoing, and I don't have the code up on GitHub. When I do, it will be available at github.com/saveitforparts alongside the code for similar antennas I've hacked in the past."
This Week in Amateur Radio is holding open auditions for news anchors for the weekly national worldwide amateur radio news service. If you have a good radio voice and can reliably read provided news copy, we are looking for you. This, of course, is an all-volunteer position. An amateur radio license is not required. You must have a high-quality microphone, headset mics are not used, and be familiar with audio editing software to record and edit your finished news stories before uploading. If you would like to try out for a weekly or bi-weekly anchor position with North America's premier amateur radio news on air and podcast, please send an email to our producer, George, W2XBS. You can include a sample MP3 of yourself reading news copy sent as an attachment to W2XBS77@gmail.com. That's whiskey, the number 2, X-ray Bravo Sierra 77@gmail.com. Be sure and use Anchor Audition in the subject line. Please include your phone number and a good window of time for a callback to discuss your submission and our operating logistics to see if This Week in Amateur Radio is a good fit for you. We hope to hear from you soon. Many of the news and information items heard in this edition of This Week in Amateur Radio have been provided by the American Radio Relay League, the ARRL Audio News Service, and the ARRL Letter, AMSAT, the Radio Amateurs of Canada, the Shortwave Listening Post, the Federal Communications Commission, the Radio Society of Great Britain, and Ofcom, the South African Radio League, the International Amateur Radio Union, the Wireless Institute of Australia and the Australian Communications and Media Authority, the New Zealand Association of Radio Transmitters, the Amateur Radio Newsline, the Rain Hamcast, Eric Guth, 4Z1UG and QSO Today, QRZ.com, the International Telecommunications Union, the 425DX News, Parks on the Air, and the Soda Reflector, and various news sources on the Internet. This Week in Amateur Radio is heard around the world on amateur radio repeater systems, streaming on the Internet, or on great low-power FM broadcast stations like WGXC-FM, part of the Wave Farm, on 90.7 MHz in Akron, New York, serving Greene County and the southern regions of New York's Capital District.
With special thanks to all our weekly news sources and to you, our listeners, that wraps up this edition of This Week in Amateur Radio. If you'd like to write to us, you can find everything you need, including archive editions of the news service, at our website at twiar.net. And now, for all of us at This Week in Amateur Radio headquarters and our news team around the world, this is Chris Perrine, KB2FAF, wishing you a 73.